key statistic for London, which is the obsession of this conversation so far on housing, is just how inefficiently we occupy land and housing. We've got the lowest density occupation per acre and occupation per house anywhere of any city in Europe, and I think almost in the world. And the reason is that we make it very, very valuable for people to invest in their houses and then pass them on to their children. The most inefficient conceivable way of building, occupying and selling and buying houses. Most architects want towers. I mean, take the Ealing case. The reason why that didn't go, it was a stupid tower. It was the tower they hated, not the housing density. The identification of housing density with towers, which is an obsession of the riparian developers of the Thames, is totally counterproductive. I just think
I think that's an older generation. I think that generation will soon be gone. I think there's a whole generation of architects who are coming on board who are all about good city building at a human scale, about stitching into the scale of London.
I think there are a lot of architects who like streets and design streets, and you're absolutely right that you can get high density with lower rise buildings. That works, but actually the problem is in central London is the multiplicity of ownership, relatively small sites. Unless you can change that, maybe go back to the Community Land Act of the Labour government of the 1970s, that might solve it, but I don't think that's not going to happen.
If the architects actually argued with the client and said, excuse me, this is not the right way to go, picking up your point saying architects should have more of a voice, if you actually tell them this is how it's done, you get the same density, you get more value, you have single aspects.
Height is merely a cipher for an unsophisticated way of creating identity.
What I'm interested to hear from people, perhaps I can start with you, Dan, is firstly whether you have found any of the propositions being put forward about housing in the manifesto so far convincing in terms of supply and demand, and secondly whether you have any view about a sort of strategic attitude that you would like to see an incoming government adopt.
I don't think any of the parties really grasp this question because it appears so complex. It's about skills. There are not enough people who can actually build things in this country, which is why we have to depend on imported labour. There is not a market which actually prospers on selling large numbers of houses. Of course, it's not in the interest of a house builder to sell too much at one time. You're pushing your profit margin down.
How are we going to cure the housing crisis? You don't cure housing crises, you affect the price of the house. And you do that best by increasing the density of occupation of land. That's the policy issue. And I kind of put my head in my hands and weep every time I hear the house building lobby stealing the argument by saying we've got to build more houses. One transaction out of 10 involves a new or recently built house. Almost all housing market is dominated by the use we make of the existing stock. We've simply got to make that more efficient.
Do you support the programme of more council housing, as it used to be called? A mass publicly funded programme?
I mean, I think you want to have a much greater involvement by government into increasing housing. But I think we should be looking at how we mix our housing and how we produce environments which are comfortable with everybody within that environment.
Describe some of the work that we're doing that is about supplying social housing that's government-led, but it's not social housing in the sort of commonly understood sense. It is estate regeneration, for example, around London. We're working on 3 major estate regeneration schemes, and I think everybody knows that local authorities are one of the major landholders in London, and the kind of post-war estates that have not survived the test of time and are kind of ghettos, socially excluding ghettos, are being really sort of redeveloped whole scale by local authorities. They, in my view, they're leading the way in rethinking complete new areas of London, and they are working in a very strategic way where there's a long-term master plan that gets outline planning permission, which they commission. They have the long-term view in redeveloping their piece of city, bringing in a social mix into a redeveloped estate.
So you've got to actually start planning areas which allow for the life cycle from student through to old age in a given area. I think just saying, well, we need to build a load of public sector housing there, bang it in there, is the wrong approach.
Would it be a good thing or a bad thing if the price of housing went down?
There has been a complete collapse in the idea of planning, the idea of big picture thinking and planning is something that Britain actually did do. There were urban development corporations.
There is enough land, it's how you release the land is the issue, and how you bring it on to ensure that you get the maximum benefit out of the land, not only in housing, but obviously to create new places where there's retail, jobs, the whole lot, not just housing.
We've spent a quarter of a century subsidising housing inflation. We've subsidised mortgage interest, we're now subsidising down payments, help to buy. All these things simply increase the price of houses. And what I despair of is the economic illiteracy of housing policy. It's not just the planning illiteracy, it's the economic illiteracy.
The planning illiteracy and so on is the consequence of those people who do get the ear of politicians. So if you recognise that there's a housing issue, try to fixate on that, then of course politicians can only cope with one thing at a time as the reason it's not being fixed. We talked a lot in the Farrell Review about the need for more proactive planning, and what's interesting is how different people have different perceptions of what that means. And I think planning, as politicians know it and talk about it, tends to be about policies and targets. And that's very different to visions and spatial design-led planning of what the future of a town or a city might look like.
Vision in the planning system.
Is it something that that your all-party committee gets involved with actually, or is that just a contextual thing because
it's going to be the subject of the next inquiry that's starting in June. That's going to be kicked off by Richard Rogers, thinking about planning policy. We're interested in thinking about generosity. I'm worried about architects' ability to kind of deliver the units that will really kind of have some foresight and think about how we're going to live in the future.
What we need is to actually make politicians feel that design is useful to them. And maybe it's not talking about design of buildings and spaces, maybe it's talking about design of policy.
I suppose I would come to the point about design and design literacy and thinking about housing, planning, infrastructure as part of that. I really see design as a way to think about challenges that are really kind of coming up. And the civil service are actually doing some really interesting work in terms of foresight. The Foresight Office looks at kind of science and technology, and they're speaking to a lot of designers about housing policy, about kind of planning for older generation, how we kind of can house older people who will be healthier and live longer lives. How can we make sure that they live good lives?
The problem with architecture is that it spans culture, but local government, transport, business, whole range. There does seem to be somewhere in government that needs to bring together those issues which actually have numerous strands that need to be coordinated, rather than having separate government departments fighting over these issues.
Well, can CLG do it? I suppose that's the question that hangs in the air.
I tried to draw a diagram lacking graphic skills of actually the relationship between this industry and government. And it's just too complicated to think that you can fix it with single point responsibility. When I worked in the private sector only, I felt that if I produced the perfect report for something and went to see a politician with it, they'd get it. The reality is you get one chance to get one idea and you pass it to a civil servant that says, I'd like to see how that works.
I have some brief comments on whether people think that the move of architecture from the Department of Culture to the Department of Communities and Local Government, i.e. the people who control housing and planning, is that a good thing? Will that make life more agreeable for the environment? What does culture mean if architecture has been excluded from its citadel? Paul?
I think the idea of switching architecture to CLG might turn out to be a mistake. It is certainly the case that the DCMS does not have, to say the least, much power inside government. And there are not that many people listening to it. It's not a great spending department and so on. But at least the DCMS, in its relationship to architecture and good design, knew what it was about. My fear is that if you go back to the theme I keep coming back to, I guess, that if it's in CLG, you're in one building that has a problem of quantity versus quality. And I think my fear is that in a sealed room somewhere, every time it comes down to that issue, it will be quantity that wins.
I think it's a very good move, and I think we've touched on so many issues to do with the planning process. that have such a huge effect, detrimental effect on us trying to produce good architecture, us trying to create good public spaces, that bringing them together is a very good move towards trying to make that conversation clearer and try to affect the planning system. I think where it was sitting, it looked as if it was something, a looking culture rather than a doing culture. And I think moving it to planning is hopefully making it more effective in that respect.
But Naomi, it would be interesting to hear from you what the attitude of the politicians is on the all-party group and what it is that's made them interested enough to be responsible with the Farrell Review for this Built Environment Select Committee, which is I think the most interesting thing that's happened in policy terms for a very long time.
In terms of politicians and thinking about housing and the public realm, I mean, if you look at the political class now, there aren't any architects. There's a couple of planners who are MPs now. The political, a third of MPs are buy-to-let landlords. The majority of architects that I speak to don't really, are not kind of involved in politics, and they don't really know anything about how the Housing Benefit Bill. They don't understand the Welfare Reform Bill. They don't understand the vast majority of kind of like real precarity and insecurity that a lot of people will increasingly face.
I'm very interested in your views on this, because I think that this is both a symbolic thing, a technical thing, a design thing, which is the £3 billion, I think that's the current estimate, of the retrofit of the Palace of Westminster.
The potential for a massive refit of the Palace of Westminster, there's really huge potential for design there. If we could think about a future Westminster as being not conservation-led, but design-led, actually thinking about the needs of the building at present. Obviously the current building is designed to be anachronistic, and given the age of what is increasingly looking to be kind of an age of coalition government, I mean, how does that really serve the purpose of the debating chamber that we want?
It is fundamentally a design challenge to how you maintain the best of the tradition in the design of that building. And of course it was about that chamber that Churchill made his overworked quote about buildings shaping us after we were shaped there. It was set up very deliberately in that way, but a lot's changed since then. The relationship of younger people to each other, to government and their relationship to the impact of electronics in the building and so on. So one really would hope that there would be a really, really intelligent piece of design that says, how do you keep the best of what there is there and bring in the best of what there has to be next? That's a design challenge. What an opportunity.
The plan of the current Palace of Westminster, I think, is the single clearest statement of the British Constitution that there is. It's a confrontational system between two chambers and between the two sides of the two chambers. And there is a relationship with the public and there's a relationship with the sovereign, and also in the original form, a relationship with the courts of justice. Of course, that's sort of disappeared from the actual palace now. In the history of the building, in the 1840s and 50s, you actually see a political system struggling to come to terms with how you procure a really complex project.
Talking about kind of the bricks and mortar Parliament was it was part of a series of essays that we commissioned around design democracy, because we're also really interested in how elections could be better run, how what online voting looks like. So I think our approach to that was to see Parliament as part of that wider system.
But the building itself, we were asked to have a look at it about a couple of years ago, and the conclusion I came to was that, and I expect Paul will agree, that the better way to refurbish a building is to empty it before you refurbish it, rather than have the people still working in it, because you save a huge amount of time and of course money. And the thought we came up with was that there's a site opposite, next to Tommy's, which is above the car park there, which would take a very fine new building, which you could design properly by a good architect, to be a building which could be used for a temporary parliament. But if you then determined to come back into the House of Parliament, then you could do. But I suspect if you created a new building, which is more along the European lines, you'd actually find people going, this is much better than what we've had before.
Whatever Jeremy says about it reflecting the British Constitution, I think that the fact that we have a two-party House based on the choir stalls of St Stephen's Chapel is pretty crazy, and will have to change, I'm sure, after this election, when we're likely to have to accommodate rather more sides to it than just two, and therefore I think we need to redesign the chamber of the House.
Thank you. Alison?
Well,
okay, you've got the job.
I'm in shock. I can't even imagine saying the words "tear it down" and build another one. I think every time I go to the Houses of Parliament, it's like the eighth wonder of the world. And the thought of somebody coming in and refurbishing it, I can just see, you know, the blue carpet tiles and the suspended ceilings coming in.
My prediction, it becomes a museum of parliamentary democracy, and we have a Euro-style bicameral chamber somewhere in the near vicinity, or in a northern city.